Religion is an ephemeral and hard to define concept, one that's often tied up with notions of tradition, culture, belief, and ideology. It's nevertheless one of the aspects of Greek culture that people remain fascinated with even today. Archaeologically, we are perpetually faced with the challenge of defining religion. The positivism and empiricism of processual theory often assumes that objects from the past are inherently archaeological, in that they're data or part of some kind of objective archaeological record. The positivist epistemology of processualism conflates the signifier with the signified. By adopting this kind of epistemology, previous generations of archaeological theory put forward a view that objects are the labels themselves, rather than that which is defined by the label. The idea that meaning is inherently fixed in an object and that we must have some kind of prior research question to make sense of this meaning denies that sites and artifacts can have meaning and thus value outside of the scientific framework. This framework of logical positivism doesn't work in the context of religion, as objects, places, and symbols can have multiple different meanings in different contexts that often reflect cultural dynamics. It's worth pointing out also that we have an inherent Abrahamic bias in the Western world. When thinking about religion, we have a tendency to assume institutionalized models, oftentimes with clearly defined clergy, holy books, strict notions of deities, among other things. Historically, though, this model is a relatively recent advancement, and it works for very few cultures in the ancient world. Both the Egyptians and the Yucatec Maya alike did not even have a word or concept for religion, at least as a separate category, as a way of living as we do in secularist society. The relegation of religion to a clearly definable and othered category is a post-Enlightenment consequence. Modern pillars of what we think of as religious philosophy, things like sacred texts, moral codes, and the promise of immortality, didn't really exist in the same way in Greece. In fact, part of the necessity and appeal of the itinerant philosophers, or the sophists, lies in their ability to articulate these kinds of moral codes. Archaeologically, then, we can discuss various constituent parts that make up what we can characterize as religious behavior, especially those that leave remains to be studied. But it's an entirely different question of reconstructing what it means to actually live as part of that religious worldview. For ancient Greek religion, then, we can study elements like sacrifice, votives, including things like dedications and libations, iconographies, especially ones that embed polytheistic and mythological narratives, especially also those that reflect changes in politics and society, as well as socially informed notions like asebeia or miasma, or pollution. And this gives us an idea of ethics and the treatments of various groups. Concerns with the dead are also ever present in religion, especially with notions of the afterlife and how to treat bodies properly, which equally opens up discussions around competition. All of these things considered, Greek religion can generally manifest archaeologically in three primary ways. There are the household or local deities, the deities of the oikos, which are usually related to families or cities. There was the symposium, during which libations would be poured for ancestors, the agathodiamons, and those not present. And more popularly, there is the demeechia, the sacred calendar. Between at least 375 and 50 BC, sacrifice was conducted publicly in or outside temples on behalf of at least 43 deities or heroes, many of which have bled through into the popular modern Western imagination. Alongside these public manifestations of religion, we can also talk about more privatized elements, like the mystery cults, open only to those who were initiated, and perhaps retaining elements of older late Minoan or early Mycenaean theology, and also things like hero shrines, the heroons, frequently dotting the landscape across Greece as pilgrimage or oracle points, like the cave of Trophonios. Religion is inherently centered on expression. It's not so much about what's going on in your head, but about what you do in practice. By understanding it as something performative, we can bridge it archaeologically. By reversing the process, then, religious expression can give us an insight into how ancient Greek people structured their minds and thought about their place in the world. Myth is first and foremost always used to describe notions of natural geography or world formation, but it's equally impossible to study or consider religion in isolation. As a tool of the state, religion intersects politics, social and ethical systems, and it holds economic implications for trade and exchange. When it comes to things like pilgrimage, consulting oracles or hero cults were also an aspect of social mobility. Only certain members of society could do that, or at least have the mobility in order to make that journey. Major sanctuaries like Delphi, Olympia, and Delos are panhellenic, in the sense that everyone across Greece would have known them and to a certain extent would have been welcomed at them. And as I covered in my previous episode, these kinds of places also held political roles as neutral ground for state negotiation because they were not owned or administered by one single polis. The origins of Greek religion, as we understand it, date back to the early Bronze Age, where various votives and figurines attesting to continuity in iconography from Minoan and Mycenaean cultures abound. Places of great religious importance are seen to be active at least from the late Neolithic, perhaps even the early Neolithic. And they also seem to have been in constant use even up to later periods. Elements don't hold true across the board though, as Greek religion was heavily regionalized and not consistent everywhere. Each city-state would have had its own values and history which informed the perspectives and lenses through which deities were worshipped there. Sometimes what's going on Crete has very little connection to what's going on the mainland, religiously speaking at least. Linear B Mycenaean texts can be useful in reconstructing elements of the Bronze Age pantheon, but they are of limited use for post-Homeric conceptions of religion, as deity roles, epithets, and myths are often markedly different. Equally, we only have administrative documents in Linear B. We have no mythic records or narratives, which affects our view of how deities were viewed. Cultic practices and places or shrines, on the other hand, are generally much easier to establish a level of continuity with. Olympia, for example, has clear evidence of altars dedicated to Zeus from at least the late Bronze Age. While the sacred tradition may have eventually evolved and culminated in the Olympic Games there, the place and land of Olympia itself appears to have had religious and sacred significance since that Bronze Age. The Idaean cave on Crete equally seems to be an incredibly ancient pilgrimage site. Excavations have frequently turned up evidence dating back to the Neolithic as early as 6000 BC. During the Iron Age, it was just as popular, testified especially by the incredible number of votive ivory deposits. Now, mythologically, for those who know your Greek mythology, both locally on Crete and throughout Greece, the Idaean is a cave in which the infant Zeus was raised in hiding from his father Kronos by the nymphs. It appears to have been such a significant and long-lived site that even the Romans erected an altar to Jupiter outside of it in the post-Hellenistic period. Interestingly, situating religion in wider society helps us understand that some of these sacred sites are also not just about mythological narratives, but also about the control of resources and political messaging. Water, for instance, especially rivers, seems to have frequently been personified and sacralized by local populations, signaling a desire to engage dialogue around who can control them and have access to them. Identifying such places as religiously significant, then, can equally serve as a way for local political units to exploit the landscape, reinforce culturally significant boundaries, and delineate access depending on status. We can also often turn to iconography studies to better understand myths and their evolutions. For instance, this votive deposit of a man fighting a centaur found at Olympia, dating to 750 BC, seems to echo similar motifs that we're seeing 300 to 400 years later during the classical and Hellenistic periods. You may also remember the Pylos agate, that was a potential precursor of a Homeric war narrative in Mycenaean Greece. Are these narratives depicting variations of the same story or myth? Or have the myths changed and adapted through time? How can these variations inform our understandings of how each period in society saw themselves and their relationships with their neighbours. Another interesting dimension of religion that archaeology can be especially useful in is architecture. Greece is naturally famed for its temples, but prior to the marble sophistication that we all know and love, interestingly, the earliest temples and religious structures that we know of, like the 8th century Temple of Apollo in Eretria, look remarkably similar to domestic houses, like the geometric one from Pelakora. These appear to be a concerted effort to emulate the megalon throne room from the Mycenaean palaces in early religious architecture, perhaps in an attempt to echo the power that such rooms once had. In many ways, religious and sacred architecture appears to be modelled off of early Mycenaean domestic architecture. Even in the late Bronze Age Mycenaean culture, though, the palace megalon itself can be seen as a scaling up of the basic village domestic architecture. So all of it just goes back to domestic buildings. Centering back on local religious expression naturally allows us to focus once again on hero cults, though. These fascinating localized shrines are first attested in Homeric literature, but frequently are administered and thought about differently depending on the region. You may remember that early Iron Age site of Lefkandi and its famous Heroon surrounded by wealthy cemeteries. This is an archetypal way of recognizing a hero cult, having a central burial of an important figure surrounded by graves of the community, wanting to be buried as close as they can to the original body. While the archetypal hero is usually a city's eponymous founder or someone significant to the community, that dynamic also changes with the advent of Athenian democracy. The tumulus of Marathon, for example, was created by Athens to commemorate the battle that for them defined Athenian identity. And yet, for all intents and purposes, they appear to have treated it in a similar manner to a hero cult, except rather than being about a single individual, this heroic idea served as a way to embody their community and respect the group that fought the battle that defined Athenian politics. It's nevertheless an interesting discussion to have. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week for another episode on Greek archaeology.